Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to our in-person audience and welcome to our online audience. This is going to be, I hope, a very interesting event. We're going to be discussing fast payment systems, which are part of the digital public infrastructure debate, something that is relatively new to me, but something that I think you're going to be seeing CSIS researching and writing about more in the future. We're very happy today to be able to feature in the beginning a report on a paper by one of our favorite authors, Kati Suominen, who I'll introduce in a moment, entitled Uptake, Use, and Inclusion Gains from Fast Payment Systems. And it's really a look at the very rapid growth of fast payment systems all over the world and what the implications are. The policy issue, I think, is becoming how are these systems structured? Some of them are government-owned and operated, which creates issues about data ownership and privacy. Some of these are public-private partnerships. Some of them are private party operated. They all have advantages and disadvantages, and they've all had varying degrees of success. And that's what Kati is going to be talking about. And following that, we're going to have a panel discussion on Kati's paper and associated issues, and there will be time at the end for audience questions. Those of you in the audience in the room, you can raise your hand and we'll come around to you. If you're online, click on whatever the button is to send in your online question, and if our technology works, they will find a way to get it to me and tell me what the question is, and I will repeat it up here. So, with that preamble, let me introduce our speaker, and that is, as I said, Kati Suominen, who is the, first of all, an adjunct fellow here at the Scholl Chair in International Business. We're very proud of that. But in her day job, she is the founder and CEO of the Los Angeles-based Next Trade Group, which helps governments, multilateral development banks, and Fortune 500 technology companies enable trade through technology. Her clients include the World Bank, the IFC, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, USAID, UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, MasterCard, Visa, Google, eBay, among many others. As you might guess from the client list, she focuses on digitization, disruptive technologies, and trade. Kati is the author of over 100 papers and 10 peer-reviewed books, most recently Revolutionizing World Trade, How Disruptive Technologies Open Opportunities for All. And so, commercial here, if you want to get it, Stanford University Press, or I'm sure Amazon and other places will make it available. So I'm saving Kati the trouble of her commercial. I'll do it for you. Anyway, let me turn the podium over to Kati, who has a slide presentation, and then after that we'll go to our panel. Kati?
Thanks very much, Bill, and thank you all for joining, and thanks also for those online. As Bill mentioned, we're kind of raising two big debates here, or addressing two ongoing debates. One is exactly on the digital public infrastructure, which are really government-backed digital systems, payment systems, identity systems, data exchanges that then enable other services and solutions like financial products and insurance services and so forth. And the other debate is around this very topic as fast payment systems, which have also proliferated around the world in the past decade more than anything. And some fast payment systems are DPIs. There are certainly also fast payment systems that are not DPIs and are led entirely by the private sector. And there, I think, is a big debate also, if we're going down the path of building these systems, who should back them, who should own, operate, and who should govern them. So that's part of this debate, but part of this is also responding to the great deal of interest that there is by developing country governments, in particular in fast payment systems, as a means of promoting financial inclusion. There empirical evidence around the question of do these systems actually promote financial inclusion is still, I think, quite limited, and there's a lot to be discussed and colleagues in the panel will probably have many years of research on this exact empirical question. Very interesting, very relevant question, obviously, for hundreds of millions of people around the world. And so we wanted to, in this panel and this discussion, kind of open more of this debate around the impacts of fast payment systems and ask, well, what is the uptake, first of all? How are these systems being used by people around the world? Do they increase the digital payments inclusion, financial inclusion, trade inclusion as well, international trade? And then how should we design these fast payment systems for optimal impact? Is there a kind of a magic design, or can we think of something systematic that we should advocate for this to have the greatest impact? So before I go into this fast payment system, I think it's very helpful for us to think of the gains that we've had over the past decade in just digital payments adoption around the world. Actually, I'm also myself quite new to this debate on DPIs and fast payment systems, and have been struck by the great results and great gains that there have been. There's still work to do, obviously, but the world has really shifted over the past decade. So if we here look at kind of on the y-axis, the share of populations in different countries that are using debit cards or credit cards, and on the x-axis, looking at kind of the share of population that is using digital payment of some kind. In 2014, kind of card use and digital payments was quite synonymous. So, if you're a European country or countries OECD nations, for instance, a large share of the population was already using cards, and of course then you were also using digital payments. But everybody's kind of on the line, and of course some African economies still quite low in digital payments use. Now we fast forward to 2017, we start to see that there's a group of countries, right, particularly African countries here, toward the bottom, that are moving kind of along the x-axis, i.e. they are adopting digital payments that are not cards, but there's more digital payments inclusion. And these are really sub-Saharan African countries. Many of you remember the mobile payments revolution in that region, led by Kenya and M-Pesa and these systems that really brought many people into the digital financial system. And then if we fast forward again another 4 years, and thanks to colleagues at the World Bank who have created all this data, we can see African countries kind of moving further and further along the x-axis, adopting digital payments that are not cards. There's kind of alternatives emerging. And then there's a bunch of countries also here, more to the right, I guess, that are, East Asian countries, China, for instance, where there's a lot of card adoption, but there's also other payments adoption going on. Kazakhstan might be another. You can think of China, Alipay, and other instruments that emerged. Kazakhstan, there was Kaspi, for instance, a big fintech that promoted payments and so on. So there have been kind of diversification of digital payments. There's not kind of one single model or silver bullet in a way. There's been different models. And if we put all of this together and again use our good work from the World Bank, our colleagues, we see that in various regions there's been really quite breathtaking gains in financial inclusion. If we think of it as use of digital payments, particularly in East Asia and Pacific, I think is really striking, but also in Africa, and the mechanisms have just been different. If we then take the bottom 20% of populations and look at the same pattern there, there's also very striking gains with the payments inclusion, particularly again in East Asia and Pacific. Advanced countries were kind of already there 10 years ago, and sub-Saharan African countries as well gaining. Much work to be done there at the bottom, if you want, to bring more people into the system, but a lot has been also accomplished already. And if we're starting to think about, well, what were the different technologies that have enabled this? One is, of course, the card kind of led model. If you simplify this, there's no hard lines. Many countries have so many different systems that it's hard to bucket countries, but let's, for the sake of argument and simplifying, Europe, countries like Turkey, the more advanced Latin American countries, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, certainly had a great deal of card adoption in the past decade. And then the mobile revolution was really in Africa. Bangladesh as well had a fintech Bcash that brought a lot of people in the system. And then we had these more hybrid models where it was China, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, others, Namibia, had different kinds of payment methods that brought people in. And now we have the fast payment system question. Well, what is this then doing in addition to what has already been accomplished, or how does this play a role? The Findex data from World Bank doesn't disaggregate fast payment systems from the overall digital payments. So it's, that would be very useful, in fact, to have in the Findex data for us to start to assess this. But we did some survey work ourselves to start to get our arms around this. So those of you who are not following this closely, these fast payment systems have really proliferated around the world. So in 2000s, there was just something in Japan. Japan was really a first mover in the 70s already, I believe, on this. But then there were more countries that started to adopt these systems in different formats. And particularly in the past 10 years, there's been really a revolution of these systems. And more countries adopting, and depends a little bit how you count. Some people might put more countries there. But really the question for us is what has been the uptake? When the system has been put in place, dropped from the sky on a market, has there been an uptake of these systems, and which systems have been adopted? And then furthermore, have there been actually these inclusion gains that governments are after with financial or fast payment systems? So I think just quickly, the value propositions behind the fast payment systems is really the real-time transfer. It's really as a digital equivalent of cash in that sense, that you transact and you see it immediately hit your bank account, and this real-time settlement is kind of an advantage. And of course, for businesses that may be in e-commerce, for instance, need a lot of cash flow and it's fast-turning business, it could be an added advantage to have these kind of immediate settlement capabilities. And then presumably these systems also promote financial inclusion if they are led by government and provided almost like a free service. So this is still a question mark, an empirical question really. Is this the case? So just to disaggregate these different fast payment systems in different buckets, one good bucket is in any which way. There has been other endeavors recently that have bucketed these in government-backed and private sector-led systems. And then there are public-private systems. So in the government-backed systems, India, Brazil, PIX, Mexico's CODI, Costa Rica, SIMPE, very kind of famous systems that have generated a lot of this interest and debate around the world in fast payment systems. But there are certainly private systems as well that have been taken up in particularly advanced countries. Canada, Singapore, Sweden has a popular system called Swish. And then there's public-private models. So for instance, the Thai system called PromptPay is kind of supported by the Thai government, obviously, but operationalized by VocaLink, which is a MasterCard subsidiary. So there have been different configurations, and of course, perhaps in the panel we can talk about the design choices, how these might impact the outcomes in the long run from DPIs. When you think about settings like we have in Brazil, where the government is creating this system, or the central bank, more appropriately, owns and operates the system, but also governs the payment system. So is this the ideal setup that we want to support? Is there a conflict of interest? It seems quite obvious. So what we did here, and this is really intended to be kind of a one volley out there to talk about these systems. This is by no means a conclusive analysis, but more to generate hypotheses. So one question is there uptake for these systems, and disaggregating these systems by these different government-backed versus private-led. And we put on the x-axis the calendar year since the system was adopted. Could be any year. We're just starting to count from zero the year it was adopted. And on the x-axis, on the y-axis, we have the share of population in a country that's adopting these systems. This data is, by the way, difficult to get. So we had to excavate this, and there's no perfect data, and not every country is up to date, but we did what we could. And what we see is kind of maybe a grouping of countries. There's some that have relatively recent adoption, but not relatively recent adoption of these systems, but not much uptake, right? They're at the bottom left. And then we have systems there at the kind of top left to the center that have had successful adoption. And perhaps the first thing that strikes me in this is that there doesn't seem to be like a very systematic pattern that a government-led system would be superior to a private sector-led system. It seems to be a mix of countries that have had success in gaining adoption. And then what also strikes me is that if you think of, for instance, the Indian UPI that has been, of course, in the news and talked about a lot, the adoption hasn't been that significant yet. Of course, it's a lot of people. When you think of 23%, 25% of Indians, it's a whole lot of people, but still, in relative terms, the adoption has been still limited. I would say compared to, say, Brazil, Thailand, Costa Rica, and certainly Hong Kong, that have tremendous adoption in the kind of relatively similar time span. And then, of course, we look at the Swedish system, the Canadian system have been around for longer, and much more uptake there. Another way to think about it, if you compare, say, sorry, the clicker is a bit funny. We compare India to Malaysia, for instance, that have attained the same level of adoption or usage of these fast payment systems. According to the data that we had, they were kind of at the same level. Malaysia, 1 year after they initiated their Do It Now payment system, whereas India had the same in 6 years. So it seems that some of these discussion, enthusiasm around certain models like UPI may not yet be born out of data. Of course, this is evolving very rapidly. So we stay tuned also for the next Findex, which is coming out soon. One hypothesis, as I was looking at this data and with colleagues also, we were looking at this and thinking about what hypotheses this may generate. And one hypothesis is that perhaps there is some kind of priors or path dependency, if you want, in the adoption of fast payment systems. So if you think of just a country adopting a fast payment system, if they have not had any, if it's totally cash-based, if there's no digital payments used, no habit of using digital payments, the journey to adoption of fast payment systems may be long and kind of more arduous than if there is already a lot of digital payments being used and there's kind of ecosystem and people are accustomed to using these payment systems. And so if we take the kind of slower adopters like Mexico, Vietnam, India, of fast payment systems, and we look at where card adoption in those economies was at the time that fast payment systems were adopted and subsequently, it seems that there was relatively little card adoption compared to the countries that had a strong fast payment system adoption. They're at the bottom that had also a strong card adoption prior to using fast payment systems. So this is a hypothesis, right? Could there be some sort of path dependency that you've had digital payments used before, and then you adopt this fast payment system, and perhaps people that are already using digital payments start to use this. Not necessarily only kind of people who are completely cash-based. And it's an empirical question that's very interesting to research. We did a survey with about 1,400 people in these 4 countries that have had a fast payment system. Thai model, of course, the more public-private partnership, the others public sector. And this illustrates a little bit. We asked how intensively do you use this fast payment system, for instance, in India or Brazil. And we segmented the populations into 3 categories: low income, medium, and high income. And this was just people assigned themselves into these categories, basically. But when we look at the low-income populations, it seems that systematically across countries, the share of populations that is actually using fast payment systems intensively is lower than among the high-income groups. So there seems to be kind of systematic evidence with this relatively small data set, but still, I think quite indicative that it is the higher income groups that use these systems more intensively in all of these countries. That is not to say that there's no adoption at the lower income groups. There is, but it seems that the more intense usage is at the higher income groups, which kind of suggests to me that maybe it is the people who have used cards or mobile payments or have a habit of using digital payments that may be substituting some of their payments. And actually, when we ask people, well, how do you think about what payments do you use for which purpose? They said that we use fast payment systems or UPI or PIX for groceries or gas and for convenience and cost. This is just a very simple way of transacting. But when it comes to, for instance, buying a, computer or washing machine or what have you, more expensive products where the access to finance, for instance, through a credit card is very useful, then the people kind of preferred using cards. So it seems that the users also require this choice, and it's good for them to have different types of systems. Another piece of interesting kind of evidence that we had, or indicative at least, was we asked by these different income groups, how do you like these fast payment systems? Do you on a scale from 0 to 100, how useful are these? And again, we see that the higher income groups see these as more valuable, it seems. So interesting findings, and perhaps speak a little bit to the discussion about fast payment systems being a kind of silver bullet for inclusion. I don't think this at least shows a little bit the opposite, perhaps, that there's more cautious adoption at the lower ends. And it's also not seen as as great of a tool as it is at the higher income groups. Again, indicative evidence brings us some hypotheses for further research. Then we also studied firms, and we surveyed about 800 firms in these 4 markets about different things, how they use fast payment systems, how they accept fast payment systems, and so forth. And we tried to get at also kind of the net benefit of fast payment systems for firms, and asking them about things like, well, is it, which is more, fast payment systems versus cards? So if you think of, fast payment system is better or card is better, we asked a survey question where we could tease out the kind of net gain or net benefit of either system. And it seems that for firms in general, the convenience, the low cost of fast payment systems adoption or acceptance is a plus. They prefer fast payment systems on those in those areas. But when it comes to cross-border transactions and international trade, or buying something from a foreign vendor, for instance, they seem to prefer cards. And that's very intuitive, right? Cards are a massive global network connecting people, just billions of people around the world to each other, whereas fast payment systems, I would argue one of the weaknesses is that they tend to be, just siloed and national, and the interoperability pilots, while there have not necessarily yet been global or nearly, just been more bilateral. And then when we asked companies that are exporters that really derive a large share of their revenue from exports about these kind of pros and cons of the two systems, we see that exporters by far prefer cards for their transactions. So that just indicates perhaps that these instruments like the interbanking system and card systems are very important for companies that are globalizing, and perhaps for companies that are in e-commerce and governments are seeking to encourage. So that's another interesting kind of piece of evidence, if you want, about the pros and cons and different uses of fast payment systems versus cards. And then the final thing that I would raise is about kind of financial inclusion. And governments built these fast payment systems, when governments built them, in part to create new financial products and services and insurance products and so on. And we wanted to ask ourselves, well, do people who use fast payment systems then actually feel like they are getting better access to finance as a result? So we grouped people in 3 buckets: people that only use cards, people that use cards and fast payment systems, and then those that only use fast payment systems. And we would imagine that those that only use are the poorer people that haven't had any other payment instrument. And it seems that across countries, again, it is the people that are using both cards and fast payment systems that also report better access to online loans or bank loans and so on. So people are saying, who are using only fast payment systems, they're saying, well, I have gained maybe 20, 30%, 40% in some countries, report having gained greater access to finance as a result of using fast payment systems. But those that are using cards and fast payment systems seem to be reporting this even more, that yes, by virtue of using these systems, I'm able to access more financing. And perhaps they are more creditworthy individuals to begin with, but it's an interesting finding about the kind of financial inclusion gains, perhaps, of these payment systems, that there is some, but not necessarily kind of revolutionizing yet access to finance for people. So So those are some of the just indicative findings, I think, that give us hypotheses and opportunities for further research. Something broader, perhaps to take a step back on DPIs, and should governments be in the business of building these kind of payment networks and digital highways, railroads, as they are also discussed as. Last year, the G20 issued a report that discussed kind of the preconditions that, once you have a digital payment network, for instance, intuitively, you should have, data privacy protections, you should have cybersecurity protections, you should have connectivity, obviously, so that people it can be diffused and so on. Many preconditions, and the G20 boiled this down to three kind of legal regulatory frameworks need to be solid in place for countries to be ready for DPIs. And then there should be some enabling financial infrastructure and so on. And we actually put numbers behind the G20 aspirations and kind of 15 variables we try to figure out, well, which countries are ready and which are not. And as we can see, kind of African countries don't seem to have the preconditions that, say, North American has, or Europe and Central Asia have, Latin America has. So there's still work to do, I think, on the fundamentals, also for countries to actually be able to adopt, operate, manage these systems. As we've seen from the fast payment system discussion, is that it's not necessary for governments necessarily to adopt these systems. It could be a private sector just as well, particularly in light of the challenges that there are to operate these systems and diffuse them. So I think the conclusions from this, and thanks for bearing with the long slides, I think the digital payment adoption is not just a one instrument and one model. There's different technologies, different models, different ownership structures, and those may matter to some extent, but there's not necessarily one single thing that matters in terms of the adoption. And it seems that simply just taking a fast payment system and dropping it in a market that doesn't have kind of the habit of digital payments probably doesn't guarantee adoption. It's probably a long journey for countries like that. And then what we see over and over is that people and firms use these payment systems fit for purpose. So they say, well, I'll use this for this purpose. I'll pay my groceries with fast payment system. I'll use my credit card to pay for my travel or for my e-commerce shopping and things like that. So it's really about user choice more than anything that I think this we would recommend. And then if we think of the government role, it doesn't seem necessary that government builds these systems to create the same inclusion gains as one might get from a private sector-led model. And furthermore, the cross-border capabilities for those of us who have worked on trade seem to be quite limited from fast payment systems, at least to date. And I think it's a long journey, of course, if we were to think of kind of a global fast payment system network, something like that. So the North Star to me, if I were say my prior job in a development bank, would be to promote this user choice. If there's, let different systems coexist and work together to the extent possible as well. And then that governments don't necessarily need to build these systems, that there are other solutions or other mechanisms, public-private partnerships and so forth. And furthermore, if we are in the business of promoting SME e-commerce and SME cross-border trade, then there are traditional payment networks that still do the job, then fast payment systems don't. And then finally, we need better measurement, obviously. This has been actually the most interesting finding personally to me, is that there's still very, very limited empirical evidence around this, and the adoption, the use, and then also the inclusion gains. So I'll stop there, Bill, but that's looking forward to the panel. Thank you very much.
Patty, why don't you take the first one? And then... You two are in the middle. I'm supposed to sit here on the end for some reason. Well, thank you very much, Kati, for that presentation. I think My major takeaway was, like the movie says, it's complicated. There's not neither a silver bullet nor a clear winner, and we'll have a little bit more discussion of that going on. But let me begin by introducing the two panelists, in addition to Kati, whom I asked to join the panel, both to participate, but also in case there are questions from the audience for her, as when we wind up later on. To my immediate left is Barbara Kochvar, who is founder and principal of Economic Insights, which is a consultancy focused on international trade, investment, and the digital economy. She also teaches political economy and Latin American studies at Georgetown University. She was previously executive director of the Visa Economic Empowerment Institute, and she's also worked at a variety of, apparently like everybody else, a variety of international organizations, including the World Bank, the IADB, and the OAS, and has advised governments across the globe on trade, investment, and regional integration. Holti Banca is a senior financial sector specialist with the Payment Systems Development Group at the World Bank. So he's not a former international organization person, he's a current one. Over the past 10 years, his work has covered different aspects of retail payments, including fast payments, CBDC, government payments, national payment strategies, cost measurement of payment instruments, payment infrastructure, interoperability, and intersection of payments, fintech, and financial inclusion, which is another topic that we'll be getting to. He has published in several academic journals and is on the editorial board of the Journal of Payment Strategy and Systems. So a distinguished panel that obviously knows a lot more about this than I do, which is always good. And so let's begin with a couple questions, and then we'll have a little bit more free-flowing discussion based on that. Let me start with Holti, if I may, and then we'll move on to Barbara. Kati briefly discussed the significant requirements for governments to take on the building and management of fast payment systems, and particularly, I think, developing infrastructure, and the risks for the government to both own and regulate the payment systems once created. So, Holti, what are your thoughts on the preconditions countries should have before they set out to build fast payment systems or digital public infrastructures in general? How is the World Bank, helping low and middle income countries to leverage fast payment systems to increase financial inclusion?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. I'm audible, right? Yeah. Thank you for the invitation. I mean, this topic is very exciting for us. It's kind of a bread and butter for the team and that I'm part of, and the work we've been doing for the last 10-15 years. Over the last few years, we've also been quite immersed into the topic of fast payments. It's a very fast evolving topic. I think the COVID pandemic, in some sense, also kind of brought a further attention to the digitization of payments, and in particular, sort of, the utility of fast payments. I think, if you look at certain indicators, including that, as of now, about 110 jurisdictions have access to fast payments, it really tells you, how quickly, things are moving. And that is through domestic fast payment systems, through regional systems, through multilateral platforms. And it is likely that with the current pace, actually, by 2030, most countries in the world will have access to fast payments. I remember a few years ago, actually, I looked at some interesting data. Basically, we sort of looked at the adoption rate of RTGS systems, which, as you know, is the large value payment systems, kind of considered the backbones of national payment systems, kind of in the first wave of their global adoption. And then we also looked at the pace of adoption for fast payment systems during also kind of that first wave that Kati mentioned, and they were actually very similar. It really tells you kind of how much sort of countries are buying into it and the value they are seeing. In the work we do at the World Bank in supporting countries reforming and modernizing their payment systems, be it through infrastructure, legal regulatory reforms, oversight, and so forth. Really, the higher objectives are grounded in financial inclusion, improving and sort of pushing towards digital economies, combating informality, facilitating trade, obviously, e-commerce, but more prominently on financial inclusion. I think it's important to note that both access to accounts and usage of those transaction accounts that, of course, allow for the usage of the digital payment instruments and methods that come with them are equally important. So I think we need to, and we indeed sort of focus on both of them. On DPIs, digital public infrastructure, indeed payments has become one of the three important components of layers, the other two being identity and data. I would say it's not so much about this infrastructure being necessarily publicly owned or operated, but rather making sure that they are serving and fulfilling some of the public policy objectives, right, including inclusion. And that's why I think at the World Bank and more broadly, we are more sort of focusing on governance structures rather than ownership structures, right? So we're obviously ownership is a subcomponent of governance, but it's more than that, right? So that's kind of one point I wanted to make on the paper, and obviously there is a lot of other variables and parameters that I think one has to look at, almost sort of a multivariate analysis to understand how those different variables sort of impact the implementation and uptake of fast payment systems, right? And here I would emphasize things like how well designed, right, inclusive the system is, right, in terms of the use cases, right, the underlying payment methods, instrument it is supporting, the overlay services, right? If different types of payment service providers have access to the system, the end user pricing, which obviously is a challenging and sensitive sort of topic, but is very important, and then obviously again how the governance side is managed. At the end of the day, I think the broader enabling environment, kind of coming back to the actual question, matters and is very important. In 2016, the World Bank, together with the Committee on Payments and Market Infrastructures, which, as you know, is one of the global standard setters in the payments world, they put together this framework known as the Payment Aspects of Financial Inclusion, or otherwise known as the PAFI framework. It's really kind of synthesized and brought together the different sort of building blocks and pieces you need in order to sort of allow in a more massive manner the adoption and usage of accounts and payments, digital payments. And I think this is also relevant for fast payments. And some of these building blocks, for instance, include commitment from the public and private sector, making sure you have the underlying ICT infrastructure in place. Of course, making sure that the regulator has put together an enabling and level playing field, sort of legal regulatory environments, and beyond that, right, making sure that with the different products and services, the payment service providers are meeting the different customer needs. And here we're talking about population segments of different socioeconomic or demographic backgrounds and profiles, right? There's always a challenge, what we call the last mile, that is left behind. And that's exactly the point of financial inclusion. We're making sure you are serving the different population segments. Financial literacy capabilities, right, awareness, which is, I believe, a job both of the private and the public sector. Making sure that we're leveraging what we call large volume, low value sort of use cases payments, for instance, remittances, government payments, right, utility bill payments and so forth, just getting people in the habit of using, accounts and digital payments. And then, of course, hoping that they will start expanding the use cases. So I think this is sort of a good framework to understand, right, what are these sort of surrounding pieces that are needed to give a chance to solutions like fast payments to succeed. And one other point that I wanted to make is that, when we think about fast payments, and in some jurisdictions, right, they're known also by the term instant, real-time, immediate, but at the very core, really they are characterized by two main features: the instant availability of funds for the payee and the 24/7 availability. But to us, it's more than that, right? Again, it's about a broader ecosystem, right? The use cases I mentioned before, the overlay services that you are kind of building on top of the core infrastructure, and even the underlying rails, sort of the lines are becoming more and more blurry between, let's say, the traditional card rails and fast payment rails, right? So theoretically, you can use card rails to process or channel fast payments. So I think, again, the bigger point here is that it's important to talk about the broader perspective and the broader ecosystem. And lastly, on how we are supporting as a World Bank, over the last years, we actually launched a large global project under the name FAST with double T, frictionless, affordable, safe, timely transaction in partnership with the Gates Foundation, where the goal is actually to support low and middle income countries to adopt, or rather accelerate the adoption of fast payments. And we are doing that through a multitude of channels, including capacity building, bilateral technical assistance on a number of areas, including technical specifications, governance, scheme rules, overlay services, and so forth. Doing a lot of capacity building together with other international partners, including the BIS, the PMI, Africa NENDA in Africa. We're also producing a lot of knowledge. So all the resources they are producing actually have been made available. We have a dedicated website, Fast Payments at worldbank.org, so anyone can check them out. We have completed about 20 case studies where we have documented the journey that countries have gone through in implementing fast payments, and a lot of different models there, including on ownership and governance. And we are also really sort of diving deep into various technical areas that matter for fast payments, including things like open banking, fraud, obviously, that is an important issue. Things related to messaging standards, scheme rules, QR codes, proxy databases, and a bunch of other areas. And currently, we're also working with the BIS on topics related to the economics of fast payments, the interplay between fast payments and CBDC, which we think is going to be quite relevant in the future. Open source, exploration, cloud services, and so forth. So there's a lot coming up. So we're quite excited. Sorry for the long answer.
No, it was great. It was great. Just to clarify, because we have an audience with different backgrounds. For you, BIS is the Bank for International Settlements,
Correct.
right? Not the Bureau of Industry and Security.
Correct.
Okay, great. Let me turn to Barbara for a minute, maybe open with something that Holti's already responded to. You want to comment on Kati's paper? Is she right, wrong, miss anything?
Oh my goodness. Thanks so much, Phil. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to share the panel with, somebody like Holti who has such deep knowledge and operational experience. I think he's probably, Mr. Payments, and Kati, who's really kind of the Taylor Swift of globalization and the digital economy. You just never know when she's going to drop another paper. So it's, it's kind of a good timing. In terms of the paper, Kati, this is just, it's tremendous. I think you've definitely exceeded your goal of doing more than the case studies that we tend to see. Now, I know the World Bank and your colleagues in some of the other international organizations have done a lot of technical work, but I think that this paper kind of brings the issues more into the mainstream, so to speak, and I suspect that your paper will help inform a lot of additional research. I think that you did just such a wonderful job of setting this stage. What I would love to see, and this is not a criticism, but this is a suggestion for how to bring together some of the elements and give us even more. You show in, I think it was figure 1 in your paper, and then you gave us more data. You kept teasing us with this longer next trade paper, so I definitely want to read the longer next trade paper. But maybe in this paper you can incorporate this. You show some great data on the different types of adoption. These were the 3 scatter plots plots that we saw, and probably others in the audience were also trying to identify the outliers. So, maybe you'll give us some of that in some case studies, which I'm going to recommend you also do. But it would be really cool to put those trends together and to see how payments evolve. And you can do this because you can think in 3D. I can't do that. I was okay with differential calculus integral when you start rotating stuff around the axes. Very difficult. And here, I know you've got a wonderful team who can, or maybe some of the awesome research assistants at CSIS can help with this. But if you could get a picture of what the evolution of payments looks like with all of these alternatives and how the panorama kind of looks. And I think that the narrative in your paper shows us that you're not going to necessarily have substitution, but you're going to have complementarity. And I think that that's a really important message. People want choice when they're using digital payments. There are different use cases, sorry to be corporate-y in that terminology, but people have different needs. And so some of the systems that are a little bit more basic, but that are way more advanced than they used to be. I mean, these fast payment systems where you can get instantaneous payment, you can buy, or transfer money almost immediately is just a wonderful sea change. And I think it provides opportunities all across the pyramid, right? So I think that would be a really nice kind of framing that can then sort of set against what I think you're coming up with some guidelines on where there's a comparative advantage for different types of actors. And I think that when you look at this, maybe bring in some more of the case studies. And a couple of decades ago, that would have seemed like a lot of case studies. Now in the big data world, perhaps less so. But maybe you can give us some indication of where you saw success and what the structures were, what the design decisions that companies and governments have made that inform that success. Now, you might not be able to do that. You showed us a very compelling graph with the adoption time frame, and so we may not have a sufficient enough time series. But I suspect that you have some ideas already of what design choices by the government, by companies, and within the enabling environment or not so enabling environment have led to the ability for these systems to fulfill the objectives that were set out. I think that would be tremendous. I think also you're so right to call out the measurement data, and perhaps this is a call to action more for Holte and the colleagues of the World Bank in seeing, and you've done a wonderful job, and you're a victim of your own success that we can criticize you on this, because we didn't used to have the global Findex, and now we all get really excited when the global Findex data is coming up because it gives us really meaningful information. And so it's kind of annoying to hear from somebody, but you could do more, but it just means how useful this is. And having more granular data, and I know how difficult this is, but I know how smart you guys are, on who is actually using this. Are we getting to the populations, looking at gender data, looking at age, looking at other demographic data, would help scholars like Kathy in the next version of the paper as well. I'm going on for too long. I know you have other questions, so I'll leave it at that.
All right. Kathy, do you want to do a commercial for your longer paper and respond to Barbara's suggestions?
In the longer version, we'll go more in depth in some of the survey data, for instance, and just look at the patterns and so on. But there are still, and then of course look at the enabling environment for DPIs in general, and kind of lay that out in greater detail and break down these systems as well around the world. So that's perhaps the commercial, but I thought also hearing from Holte about the complexity, right, that we also, I think, observe in this, and you've observed, of course, and this multivariate analysis almost to look at the determinants of what actually creates success I think we now have the precondition or the opportunity to do that, given that there is quite a lot of data by now. If you look at the just transactions per capita, things like that people oftentimes use, which are not perfect because you don't necessarily see by income group, but nonetheless there is data. So perhaps we are at a point where we can start to do some of that, econometric work, if you want, maybe even machine learning work. But I appreciate that comment as well.
It's a matter of fact, if I may just quickly add, we are, so one of the resources we have created as part of Project FAST is a global fast payments tracker, where almost in real time we're monitoring implementations, but also populating with sort of high level but very relevant information for scholars and researchers like yourself to sort of go and extract and sort of do analysis. So I think hopefully that can also facilitate some of the additional further research. And also one point that Barbara made that is very important: how do we quantify, right, the impact of fast payment in the context of inclusion, right? And there, of course, there are more specific indicators, including the impact on gender. We're actually very soon going to embark on a randomized control study in Brazil to specifically sort of study the impact of PICs on those indicators. And hopefully that will give us, at least in the context of that country, some insights, and we can then expand.
Let me pursue some of these themes. First with Holti. I think what we've learned is this is not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's a fast-growing, fast-changing technology. Adoption is growing rapidly and spreading amongst countries. And again, not one-size-fits-all, multiple instruments. So Holti, what are your views, and you can respond on sort of what the bank is doing, on the optimal pathways for countries to promote payment adoption among the poor, and to ensure what we've all also talked about, user choice?
Maybe starting from the last point, user choice is indeed a very important principle that we always kind of have it at the forefront of our work. But I think it's important to balance that with ubiquity, interoperability for the end user, and making sure that the end user is not overwhelmed, right? Sort of in the presence of these multiple choices. I think ultimately sort of user choice will sort of derive from having a sort of open market competition, innovation that will bring all these different products and services to cater, as I said at the beginning, to the different needs of the population segments. In terms of pathways, indeed, sort of having the global perspective and having looked very closely at different approaches, implementation models. Some countries that already had a fast payment system, but kind of have had to go back to the drawing board and rework on certain aspects and elements. I think it's important to note that it's a dynamic process, right? It doesn't mean that once you have implemented a fast payment system, whatever rails you are using, it's kind of the end of the game, right? You always have to be alert as a system operator. But even more importantly, it is the payment service providers, right? The different types of PSPs that have connected the systems are the ones interacting with the end users, right? The individuals, the merchants, that kind of can read better the pulse of the market. And I think they are the ones that sort of need to be alert and be able to go in and build those additional services. I think the interesting thing about the fast payment infrastructure is that you can have the core system and then, have additional overlay services on top of it, right? Including, for instance, I'm getting a bit too technical, but things like request to pay, right? Or the use of aliases, right? Where simply using a phone number, right, you can initiate a digital payment. You don't necessarily need to remember the entire bank account or transaction account number. So all these, are elements that actually have been built on top of core infrastructures, actually by payment service providers themselves, even when the core system is operated or owned by central bank, for instance. But kind of taking a step back, In terms of I think the bigger elements, I would sort of classify them into 5 buckets, sort of critical success factors, let's say. 5 main buckets where under each I think we can single out particular elements. The first one is public-private cooperation. And here, for instance, one can utilize fora such as a National Financial Inclusion Committee or National Payments Committee that really brings together the different stakeholders and actors that, at the end of the day have the same common agenda in helping countries, modernize national payment systems. Also making sure that, as we said before, there is an inclusive sort of governance mechanism regardless of the actual ownership, structure and model of the payment system. The second one would also be the broader role that the central bank or the public sector plays. And again, it goes way beyond just, ownership or operation. We know that the central bank actually is typically the overseer of the payment system. So making sure that, they anticipate different risks that a system or the different service providers could bring into the broader ecosystem, and making sure they have the safeguards in place to, mitigate those risks. Financial literacy that I mentioned at the beginning, right? They also have the tools alongside the private sector, using the curricula in the public education and so forth. The third component, I think, would be interoperability. I could not, stress this more. Making sure that, different types of payment service providers have access to the system. So essentially, you're creating interoperability from within the system, adopting what now are considered global, emerging messaging standards such as ISO 20022. The fourth one, I would argue, is putting the needs and demands of end users at the forefront. This links a little bit to the whole idea of end user choice. So again, making sure that you're bringing to the table the different use cases, transaction channels, right? Be it QR codes, or other sort of easy to use channels for merchants, but also individuals. Making sure that the end user pricing right there, you strike a balance between public policy objectives, but also incentives for the private sector to innovate, right? So at the end of the day, nothing is for free, right? There's obviously an underlying cost for whatever infrastructure is being provided. And the last point I would say pertains, or the last bucket, to the whole idea of consumer protection, right? Data privacy, consumer protection frameworks need to be put in place. With the emergence and advancements of technologies, we have rise of new types of risks and threats. Making sure that the safeguards are in place for cyber attacks or fraud, which unfortunately it is the Achilles heel still of fast payments because exactly of the instant nature. And I think fast payments here have a lot to learn from the card industry when it comes to fraud. And it needs to be tackled at all 3 levels, right? At the system level, the payment service provider level, but also the end user level, right? So multi-factor authentication and so forth. So these would be kind of the 5 areas that I would emphasize. It's a bit, again, of a long answer, but
that's all right.
To be comprehensive.
We have a little bit more time. Barbara, let me turn back to you. You have experience with a digital payments company in the past. Talk a little bit about this from the perspective of a payments provider. What kinds of design choices should we think of advocating to ensure that especially government-led fast payment systems don't undermine competition or discriminate against, for example, U.S. payment providers?
So I think what Holte was saying is really, really important. And I mean, Holte said a lot, and he said a lot of different things that are important. But just to kind of summarize, as he was getting technical, I think one of the things that came out for me is the importance to allow for market-appropriate innovation, right? To allow for the types of payment solutions in a market that are going to meet the evolving needs of end users. And as you said, it's complicated, Phil. Right? It's difficult to keep up with those evolving needs. And so you need different actors, you need different perspectives. I think from your question about the government-led models, and here I draw perhaps more on my experience as a student of Latin American economic policies, particularly trade policies over time, and industrial policies more so than my experience at a payments company. I think that you need to really have an approach that allows for different solutions to thrive, even if they're not the ones that you necessarily pick. Now, you don't have a lot of data in your data set yet. I mean, you have a lot of data, you don't have a lot of time. That's not your fault, but hopefully you'll be continuing to work on this data set over time. And when we have our reunion in 10 years, you'll have some really cool stories for us. 10 years is not that long. I mean, we'll, in a blink of an eye, we'll be back here talking about...
Easy for you to say,
right?
you're not my age.
Well, not that far from, but what I think would be really useful in the study also is to take a look at the differences between, and however you want to define these, operators that take a heavy-handed versus a light-touch approach, and what the ultimate successes are there. So, and what I mean by that is that we've seen some announcements of payment systems that are government-owned and operated that have had tremendous success if you measure it in terms of like transactions usage. And so I worry whenever you see a government say something like, and we're going to displace these solutions that are already in the market. That just as a trade economist and a student of kind of industrial policy, that gives me the heebie-jeebies, so to use a technical term. So I would really encourage governments, private sectors, scholars, to look at Kathy's paper, first of all, because I think the message comes out really clearly there that consumers and businesses prefer to have multiple options. And so when I say heavy-handed versus a light touch, those who promote an enabling environment, who provide the infrastructure upon which you can develop the types of solutions that you're talking about, that take into account consumer needs, that take into account interoperability, you want them to meet high standards, and you really want them to meet high security standards. I mean, there's a difference between buying a cup of coffee and buying a trip to Europe, for example. And this was brought home to me. I used to be a figure skating mom, had lots of conversations with people at 5 o'clock in the morning, and had one mom who had bought a ticket through, I think at that point it was the Thomas Cook, where the company from which she bought her ticket had gone bankrupt. She was stranded in France, not the worst place to be stranded, but she was just really, really happy that because she used a credit card, she was able to get her money back for that, and therefore send her kid to additional skating competitions. Anyway, so there are lots of there's a different cost to providing that kind of service. Consumers and businesses value those different types of factors that come with different types of payments. So I would say, promote a light touch that enables the environment in which you can get access to companies, to different solutions that will meet those needs, rather than promoting a particular solution, because that particular solution may be the right one at this time, but may not be one that will meet the evolving needs of users.
Let's pursue that. We're getting some audience questions coming in, which is great, but I've got another one for Barbara, and that alludes to your Thomas Cook example in a way, which is let's talk about fast payment systems and trade. I think the thrust of Kathy's report was that the systems really are pretty much domestic instruments that don't enable international cross-border transactions. So Barbara, maybe you can say a few words about how we should think about fast payment systems and trade. Will their adoption, if it continues to be widespread, risk fragmenting the global trade landscape? Can they help SMEs, for example, increase their involvement in trade? Could there be eventually interoperability, one of Holt's buckets, eventually be interoperability amongst fast payment systems in different countries or between them and card networks?
So that's a great question. If we have a couple of hours, I think we could probably.
No, we don't have
We're
a
not
couple
going
hours.
to do that.
We do have a couple minutes.
We
yeah,
do
so
have
go
a couple
ahead.
of minutes. So, I mean, I would say that this is such an important consideration for businesses and for policymakers as they're developing these systems. You know, everybody wants to enable their SMEs. The small businesses make up, over 90% of businesses in so many countries. We don't need to tell the trade guy the importance of trade and what trade can do to small businesses. But they do tend to create jobs. They tend to create more jobs that have better wages. For women-led businesses, this is so important. And we've seen such a rise of small businesses, and particularly women-led small businesses, through the pandemic. And this is a group of people that trade policymakers and digital economy policymakers should really want to support. They should want them to not only be able to continue to survive, but to thrive. And the best way to do that, or one of the best ways to do that, is through trade. When you have some of these systems just don't allow for trade. And so if that's the main or the only solution in market, then you're going to cut off your small businesses from this multiplier effect that exporting can have. If you can't accept payments from other countries, you're going to be really tremendously limited. And so I think you raise an excellent point, and it's totally appropriate that you raise the trade point, and that should be of great import for policymakers and the international organizations, not just the World Bank, but the BIS and others that are developing these multilateral systems of fast payments, thinking about how to connect them. Maybe you should look at your operating unit or your main protagonist, the micro, small, medium enterprise.
Okay, we have some audience questions. I'm going to start with the online audience for once, rather than the reverse, but I see we have some live questions as well. We'll get to those as well. The first audience question is an interesting one. How have governments, and if so, how, included fast payment systems in their own operations? Any ideas about that?
So if I understand the question correctly, I suppose they mean channeling government payments, right? Different social assistance types of payments using a fast payment system. Yes, actually, several countries, Pakistan comes to mind, right, to their fast payment systems. As a matter of fact, they managed to digitize about 3 million payments to beneficiaries through their fast payment system. I know several countries also during the COVID times used their fast payment system to deliver in real-time payments to those in needs, indeed. So in that sense, I think more such use cases have been incorporated, and in the context of the PAFI framework that I elaborated on before, government payments are actually one of those really large volume use cases that you can really utilize in order to bring more people into the form of sort of financial greed, at least in terms of accessing transaction accounts. And from then on, they can choose sort of how they utilize, those accounts and the different types of payment methods, they are using.
Okay, I think we had a live audience question over here. Wait for the microphone. The rules are tell us who you are and then ask a question.
Hello, my name is Jacob Snyder. I'm a fellow of the American Moment. So I was wondering, I think you did a good job explaining to me how within our national intra-trade systems that this will be a mass expansion. But looking at the international trade, what kind of national security arguments might be made to kind of prevent the expansion of the interoperability, the standards, and just generally any greater integration of these systems from a defense standpoint?
Before you respond, that actually is consistent with with an online question. So let me add that one to this, which is, are there any potential heightened cybersecurity risks associated with fast payment systems relative to other methods of payment? So Who wants to take either of those on?
Barbara, would you like to start?
I think I'll defer that to you. You have a greater panorama.
I would say, I mean, not so much on the cyber front. I think, any type of, payment system obviously, would sort of run that risk, right? And I think, more and more countries are paying, attention to that. And, but I would say sort of different types of frauds, I think, is where we need to be kind of, more focusing on, especially at the consumer level. And not just sort of the clear, type of traditional fraud we're used to, but, social engineering where you still, as the account holder, are still sort of authorizing, payments. Making sure that we are, I think artificial intelligence can help in that context, sort of analyzing, patterns rather than, individual, obviously personal data, and helping anticipate and track some of these perpetrators. Yes, I would kind of place fraud rather than the larger kind of cybersecurity issue as a focal area, I think, for the countries and for the international community, I think, to focus on. On the question of sort of cross-border, it is true that if we think about these sort of multilateral platforms that some of the international organizations like the BIS is thinking about, they have challenges related to governance, oversight, and I'm sure under those two buckets, obviously data protection is there. Some countries actually have gone for bilateral linkages. So basically focusing on corridors that sort of make sense for them in terms of trade volumes, remittances, and they obviously feel more comfortable that they can establish, through those bilateral links also the appropriate, data protection safeguards. There is obviously they have more harmonized also overall legal frameworks and environments. But replicating that, on a global scale, definitely has its challenges. Again, the card networks obviously have been around for decades, have a well-established, global sort of network. I think have looked at that a lot. And as I said at the beginning, fast payments can learn a lot from the card industry when it comes to fraud.
Barbara, do you want to add anything?
I think you've done a great job of addressing that. I mean, it goes back to placing security as a premium and as a key principle, and then also having kind of a common, robust set of data use principles and making sure that the system is a trusted system and responsive to that. And then also, I mean, if the system isn't trusted and if these concerns, if consumers and businesses are sensitive to these concerns, whether in the country or others with which they may be interacting, then the systems won't be used robustly. So definitely a key issue that people are thinking about a lot. Solutions are evolving, as are more and more challenges, of which I'm sure you're quite aware.
Okay, I have an online question for Holte. How do fast payment systems fit into World Bank's development projects?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is a great question. It goes actually back to the initial point I made where, payments as such, right, are grounded into higher, level objectives. The broader kind of, goals of the World Bank, which is reducing poverty, and increasing shared prosperity in a livable planet. Now we have kind of added that to our World Bank mission. We of course explained before the mechanism through which financial inclusion does sort of help in those objectives, right? By bringing people into the form of financial grid, you are not just giving them access to accounts and digital payment methods, but also to additional digital financial services, right? So in some sense, accessing accounts or payments almost an entry point to a wide variety of other critical services, including access to finance, right, to credit, insurance, right, microinsurance, if we're talking about the micro and small merchants, at times of crisis, right, be it sort of a natural disaster or a pandemic, right? So, people are safeguarded by having access to those types of services and sort of mitigation mechanisms to be able to cope. So these are, kind of very practical, kind of, on the ground approaches and mechanisms how through our work, right, payments, including, of course, fast payments, we're supporting these higher level objectives of the World Bank. Mentioned before also digitization of economies that, we know obviously are supporting and helping in the further economic growth, and making sure that also there is, more people coming into the formal sort of side of the economy, so to speak. It doesn't mean that, cash will disappear, obviously, but, you are sort of, by digitizing, you are helping remove some of that, shadow economy. So I think it's quite relevant in multiple different, departments and sectors, right? And I think we have that kind of in our mind, right, as how we are supporting the bigger objectives through our day-to-day work.
Yeah, maybe Bill, if I may, the colleague raised the national security aspect. I think there's also the competition policy issues that we're actually working on at CSIS, where we're seeing this trend around the world where there are these kind of European DMA-like regulations spreading, and that are really handicapping when you look at the impact on US companies in particular, since they are quite targeted to big US platforms. And I would say there's a bit of an analogous thing that, Barbara, you alluded to as well, going on in this space where, some countries are establishing these systems and explicitly the central bank is saying we're wanting to push out the US, our most successful businesses that are the payment providers. So I think this is a very important part of the debate that we haven't really, discussed here, but is of course something that should be discussed more. Are some of these design choices handicapping the private sector in general, and in particular US companies, in which case one could talk about maybe discriminatory impacts and things like that as well. But I thought that this seems to be tying to that, and we've had some prior discussions, I think, at CSIS on DPIs in general, and once countries may be putting these in place and governments are backing these systems, that perhaps it's not so easy to stop there. That maybe, we see this impetus of governments going into e-commerce or going into logistics or healthcare and so forth.
Healthcare, education.
So then I think there is a much bigger discussion here of the design issues, and I really appreciate, Holte, you bringing up the private sector involvement in the design phase. Like, it has to be built in that point, yes, where we then ensure that there is innovation, we ensure that there is competition in the market, which then, of course, serves the objectives of the World Bank to support the
competition. It's a new word.
Competition, yeah.
Sure. So it's both collaboration, healthy competition, and level playing field. It's indeed, I think that's.
I just learned that word earlier this week in a different context. We have an audience question. Yes.
Good morning. This is Arne Vogels. I'm with MasterCard. This was a really refreshing conversation. I like the openness and the public-private, obviously, coming from the private sector. One question that keeps us kind of really engaged in this entire debate is the role of regulation when it comes to the success of financial inclusion and through real-time payments. This is the topic. How much do you think that regulation impacts the success or not? That's one. And the second part would be, what would best practice principles look like when we think of creating a conducive environment towards creating financial inclusion in the best possible ways, not just access, of course, but also what you were talking about, moving it into insurance and credit.
Who wants to take that one?
Like to start?
I mean, I can start. I think so. There's necessary regulation and good regulation that helps to provide a good business environment in which consumers are, feel and are protected, and businesses as well. I think they're already. This is a pretty regulated area already. There's a lot of experience. I think that where you want to be careful in implementing these systems is setting out regulations and also kind of de facto practices that don't allow for innovation. And I don't know whether the paper will go into this, or whether, I mean, I know the World Bank has done a lot of thinking about this. The World Bank also is one of the authors of sort of good regulatory practices. And I would love to see the bank, I know that they're kind of the core good regulatory practices. I don't know that that work has extended into the digital space. So this might be a really fortuitous moment to kind of set out good regulatory practices for digital payments, for DPIs even, and for the digital age, not to, make more recommendations for work for my former bank colleagues.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, yes, I'm not a lawyer, by training, but obviously a lot of our colleagues are focused on the legal, aspects of payments as we assist countries, right, to sort of modernize, reform, also their legal regulatory environment. But I think obviously, making sure the access point is, I've reiterated, is very important. As you know, a lot of countries have gone towards this approach of basic accounts, right? Making sure that the particular vulnerable, as we call them, population segments have access to accounts through simplified procedures or, lower fees. Again, to make sure that they are brought into the form of financial grid, consumer protection then from then on. And then I think there are, some bigger principles, proportionality, right? Again, making sure that you're creating a level playing field between the different types of payment service providers, being, fairly agnostic and, focusing on the service. As you know, you have kind of the European sort of model with the Payment Services Directive that is, quite comprehensive. And then you also have, other models in Australia and Latin America. So there's different approaches, but I think we're more and more moving kind of, towards that sort of a more kind of decentralized, legal kind of, regime where, again, central banks or regulators are focusing on the particular, service rather than the institutional nature, right, of the particular payment service provider. And, hopefully that will indeed lead to more sort of, fair competition and more innovation in the market. But it's not, it's definitely, not an easy sort of area. And again, we as a World Bank, would try to have these principles in mind.
Maybe some guidelines for if you are the operator and the regulators, what can and can you not do, right? Because that's kind of an unusual situation. There aren't that many cases in which you have kind of a successful long-term story of being regulated by your competitor. So I think that, when you're talking about governance, and this may be a model that, you start to see more and more, and in which case I think institutions that have a global overview and that are the proponents of kind of best practices, good regulatory, and have this wealth of information, could kind of pay some mind to how to encourage future success for all actors. Sorry to jump in.
No, we're getting near the end here. We have another online question, and let's see if we can keep our answers short on this one. Although it's not a short question, but it's a clever one. How can private and public entities help increase usage of fast payment systems in countries that have the infrastructure to do so and yet have a low uptake rate, such as the United States?
Yeah, I think my conclusion from that data, which was a little bit here and there, and UK, for instance, had a long journey, and still the uptake isn't that high. And then you look at the Swedish model and so forth. So, it could be that in these advanced markets where there has been already quite a diversity of payment systems that doesn't really, some systems just don't take off any longer. That could be the case. Or it may be a matter of timing in some cases. Like I think the Swedish model was very well timed for there to be adoption. But yeah, it's a good question. It seems that the advanced countries, some have had great adoption and others have had less adoption. But perhaps in those markets there's some difference to developing countries, for instance. We have such a, prolific or diversified payments ecosystem already in place.
Anybody?
Yeah, please.
Very, I mean, this is not very sophisticated, but perhaps identify the pain points that are not allowing or not encouraging adoption, and perhaps public education to the existence of these alternatives and how they may be beneficial.
It will be interesting to see. I mean, right now the U.S. has actually two fast payment systems, right? RTP, which is the private, and then FedNow, which was recently launched.
Yep.
So it'll be interesting to see. But as Kati mentioned, the U.S. already, there is good usage of digital payments in general. Of course, it doesn't hurt to have more options. But I think it will be interesting to see how these two systems will supplement.
Okay, any more audience questions out there amongst the live people? Wait, in the back.
Great. Thanks very much for this event. Incredibly rich discourse. Katya, I'm not sure there's any higher honor than being called the Taylor Swift of payments. I previously described you as a superstar, but I'm not doing you justice. So going forward, I will do that. I have a question about some of the empirical work that you presented at the top of the discussion, Kati. There was a slide about uptake and percentage of daily transactions disaggregated by income groups. So it was a surprising finding, I think, for most of us. I think it would be a very surprising finding and complicated to explain for governments who are very driven by financial inclusion as the main motivator. And that's a complicated and complex discussion to now have. So I'm curious if you could say a little bit more. You touched briefly about what some of those reasons might be for why at the low income group you're not seeing higher uptake as a percentage of daily transactions that are being conducted. I assume that research is only filtering on people who do have access to mobile phones. So it can't be a technology access issue. And it's probably not an issue around cost of doing the transaction. So what might be some of the issues? Is it design related or something else? And if there's enough time, I'd love to hear about the RCT in Brazil that is happening. I think RCTs are the gold standard of impact assessment, and we've discussed here in this talk that it's time to get to that next stage of really figuring out actual impact of these systems, and I think there's no better methodological approach than that. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree. It's great. This upcoming study is very, very useful. Rami, I think my question was also like, don't people have mobile phones? Isn't it easy for just about anybody by now? There may be, of course, some gaps there but then they took the survey, which indicates that they used the mobile phone because there was an online survey and mobile survey as well. So these users at least had phones. I assume it's ingrained habit of transacting in cash, probably with merchants on the street or what have you, and just part of, perhaps it's on the acceptance side as well, because it's basically a network. So perhaps it is still in the lower income groups where you have more of the use of cash, and it may be both on the user side and payer side and payee side and the acceptance side. And we actually see that with firms as well. When we disaggregate merchants to kind of more low income or small, very micro enterprises in cities, we see the same, right? So we see the same with the firms. When we look at the mid-sized companies, small mid-sized companies that are exporters, they love accepting also fast payment systems, not for trade, but in general, just because they are more digitized. And wanting to accommodate their digitized customers, I assume. So I think it's a little bit both ways, but there's probably this still persistent use of cash that's on the way, and it can be on both sides. That would be my hypothesis.
If I can just very quickly add, actually, what we have noticed is that a lot of these systems actually have limited use cases capabilities. So as striking as the number I mentioned at the beginning of 110 jurisdictions having access to fast payments might be, it doesn't tell the entire story, right? So there's still a lot of work to be done, even with those countries that have already, established a fast payment system. So it's not just about those that, don't have one. So we are indeed, focusing on those as well. And of course, what Kati mentioned is indeed very valid as well.
Well, we're past time. Stay tuned for Kati's paper, which has all been posted online today. Go to the CSIS.org, the Scholl Chair, look at publications. You should be able to find it. The charts that she showed in her presentation are all in the paper, so you can get them from that. Stay tuned for her further paper. Stay tuned for further CSIS research on the subject. And thanks to two of the most well-informed, or three actually, of the most well-informed panelists I've ever run into. I thought it was a fascinating discussion. I learned a lot, and I hope all of you out there, both online and in the room here, did as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.